It's August 15th, 1947. You stand among a crowd in Delhi as the Union Jack is lowered for the final time. After nearly 2 centuries of domination, Britain's rule over India, the shining jewel of its empire, has come to an abrupt end. Not because of compassion, not because of moral awakening, but because Britain is broke. World War II has gutted its economy. National debt has exploded to over 200% of GDP. The treasury is empty, and without India's wealth to drain, there's no way to finance the empire anymore. Here's what few people realize. India's independence wasn't a gift. It was a financial surrender. The British Empire didn't grant freedom. It simply could no longer afford to hold on. And when India slipped away, the entire imperial system began to collapse. To understand how this empire fell, you have to go back to where it all began. December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth II signs a royal charter granting a group of English merchants exclusive trading rights with lands east of Africa and west of the Pacific. It was called the East India Company, and it would become the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. At first it looked harmless, trading spices, textiles, and tea. But soon, this company began operating like a nation-state. By the 18th century, it commanded a private army of 260,000 men, twice the size of Britain's own military, a corporation with its own army, its own currency, its own empire. The turning point came in 1757, at the Battle of Plassey. After defeating the Nawab of Bengal, the company was granted the Diwani, the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. That meant control over 30 million people and one of the richest regions on earth. In just a few years, the East India Company shifted from merchant to monarch, ruling, taxing, and exploiting at will. It monopolized salt, tobacco, and opium, forcing Indian artisans to sell at prices 40% below market value. Weavers who had created some of the world's finest fabrics for generations were reduced to bonded laborers. Then came the Bengal famine of 1769-1770, when between 7 and 10 million people perished. The company offered no relief. Taxes continued as usual. They literally taxed people to death. This wasn't a failure of policy. It was policy. By 1750, India made up a quarter of global industrial output. By 1900, that number had collapsed to just 2%. Why? Because Britain didn't just conquer India, it deindustrialized it. Indian markets were flooded with British goods, sold tariff-free while Indian producers were crushed under heavy taxes. British factories bought India's raw cotton for nothing, spun it into textiles, and sold those same goods back to India, profit guaranteed, competition destroyed. Between 1850 and 1896, textile imports from Britain soared from 5 million to 18 million. India's legendary weavers were wiped out, and between 1600 and 1871, India's GDP per capita fell from over 60% of Britain's to less than 15%. It was systematic, it was deliberate, and it made Britain rich beyond imagination. Then came the next level of corruption, the opium trade. The East India Company became the largest drug dealer in the world, forcing farmers to grow opium, which they exported to China in exchange for silver and tea. When China resisted this addiction, Britain declared war, the First Opium War of 1839-1842, and they won. Britain literally went to war to defend its right. The opium trade became Britain's second largest source of government revenue, right behind land taxes. India had become the empire's plantation and the empire's victim. In 1857, Indian soldiers of the East India Company's own army rose in revolt. It was one of the greatest uprisings in colonial history, but Britain crushed it brutally, and then sent India the bill. The cost of suppressing the rebellion was charged entirely to Indian taxpayers. They paid for their own defeat. After that, the British Crown took direct control of India, dissolving the company but expanding its extraction. The Indian Army was reorganized, 65,000 British troops, 140,000 Indian soldiers, all funded by Indian taxes. Half of India's revenue went straight to maintaining the empire's military machine. The railways are often celebrated as Britain's great gift to India, but the truth is darker. Between 1860 and 1890, India's rail network expanded from 1,300 to 25,000 kilometers, funded by Indian debt. The contracts required that all equipment be purchased from Britain, so India borrowed the money, paid for construction, and Britain pocketed the profits. Infrastructure built to move British troops and goods, not to help Indians. Economist Dadabhai Naoroji called this the drain of wealth. He calculated that Britain extracted between $30 and $40 million from India every year, while reinvesting less than $250,000. He called it vampirism, and he was right. When wealth leaves a nation and never returns, that nation bleeds. This drain only deepened during the World Wars. By 1918, more than 1 million Indian soldiers had fought for Britain across every major front. Gallipoli, France, Mesopotamia. Over 150,000 were killed or wounded. But even that sacrifice wasn't enough. India shipped millions of tons of wheat, cotton, timber, and other supplies, most of it paid by India itself. The colony even gave Britain a gift of 100 million to fund the war effort. By World War II, the numbers became catastrophic. The British Indian Army swelled to 3.35 million men, the largest volunteer force in history. Britain financed its war effort by issuing IOUs called sterling balances, massive debts owed to India. By 1945, India was Britain's biggest creditor. And then came the Bengal famine of 1943, a man-made disaster that killed between 800,000 and 3.8 million people. While India starved, Britain diverted food to Europe. Winston Churchill coldly remarked that Indians must learn to look after themselves. He even suggested that India should pay Britain for its own defense, using the famine as leverage to erase debt. It was imperial arrogance at its peak. By the end of the war, Britain was broken. Its debt was twice the size of its economy. Exports had collapsed. The empire was bankrupt. The US stepped in with a $3.75 billion loan, and Canada with another $1.9 billion, lifelines that Britain wouldn't finish repaying until 2006. But the empire itself was finished. Without India's wealth, Britain's global machine couldn't run. On June 3, 1947, Britain announced its withdrawal. By August 15th, the flag came down. It wasn't a gesture of grace, it was a retreat of desperation. In 1700, India accounted for 27% of global GDP. By 1947, it was just 4%. Meanwhile, Britain's share had risen from 2.9% to 9% during the height of its colonial extraction. For 200 years, Britain's rise was India's decline. When the drain stopped, so did the empire. After independence, India began to rebuild. In 1947, the average life expectancy was 27 years. By the turn of the century, it had more than doubled. In just a few decades of self-rule, India achieved what 190 years of British development never did. Britain may have won the war, but it lost its empire. The Commonwealth replaced the colonies, and by the 1960s, most of Britain's territories were gone. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the planet had dissolved into history. But history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. Today, the United States stands where Britain once stood. A global superpower with 750 overseas bases, trillions in war debt, and a financial system stretched thin. Britain's power was built on colonial extraction. America's dominance depends on the dollar's supremacy, global trade access and military presence enforcing it. But when debt piles up and costs of empire outweigh the returns, decline begins. Just as Britain's control collapsed when India slipped away, America could face its own reckoning when the dollar loses its global grip. Britain's debt reached 200% of GDP by 1945. America's today isn't far off. History has already shown what happens next. Empires don't fall in a day, they bleed out slowly. Through arrogance, overspending, and the illusion that power lasts forever. The British Empire's trillion-dollar mistake wasn't just financial, it was moral. It was believing you can drain the world forever, without consequence. And when the bill finally came due, the sun that once never set on the British Empire set for good.